The champagne flutes clinked around me as Svetlana Volkov's voice cut through the wedding reception like a knife through silk. Standing at the microphone in her emerald gown, my new mother-in-law smiled warmly at the 200 guests packed into the Pittock Mansion ballroom before her eyes landed on me with ice-cold precision. "My son could have married anyone," she announced in her thick accent, "someone from a good family, someone with real culture and breeding. Instead, he chose this ordinary American girl who brings nothing to our family." The room fell silent. My wedding dress suddenly felt too tight, the delicate lace constricting around my ribs as every eye turned toward me. Derek, my husband of exactly 4 hours, squeezed my hand under the table but said nothing. He said nothing. "Let's see how long this lasts," Svetlana continued with a dismissive wave toward me, "when he realizes what he's settled for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The microphone clicked off. Polite applause followed, though I could hear the gasps and whispers underneath. What I didn't say in that moment, what nobody in that room knew except my immigration attorney sitting quietly in the back, was that I had been the only thing keeping Derek Volkov in this country for the past decade. Every visa application, every renewal, every legal fee, every affidavit of support had my name on it, my income backing it, my legal liability guaranteeing it. Without me, Derek would have been deported years ago. But I smiled through my humiliation, cut the cake, danced the required dances, and began planning my exit from a family that would soon learn exactly how much this ordinary American girl had brought to their table. I met Derek Volkov on a rainy Tuesday in March at a marketing conference in Seattle, back when I was 26 and still believed that love could flourish in the space between ambition and compromise. He stood near the refreshment table during a break between panels, somehow managing to look both sophisticated and slightly lost as he studied the coffee options with intense concentration. His accent caught my attention first when he asked me which blend I recommended, followed by his self-deprecating laugh when I pointed out they were all the same generic conference coffee regardless of the label. We talked through the next session, then dinner, then stayed up until 3 in the morning in the hotel lobby sharing stories about our vastly different childhoods. Derek had arrived in America 6 years earlier on a student visa to study business at a state university in California, though his real education had come from working 3 jobs simultaneously to support himself after his funding fell through. His determination impressed me. His vulnerability disarmed me. The way he looked at me like I was the most fascinating person he'd ever encountered made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced before. Our relationship accelerated with the intensity of 2 people who believed they'd found something rare. Within 3 months, Derek had moved from California to Portland to be closer to me, finding work as a consultant for small businesses trying to expand internationally. His visa situation came up casually at first, mentioned in passing during a conversation about his future plans. The student visa had expired. He was currently on an employment-based visa through a small import company, but the owner was elderly and talking about retirement, which would terminate Derek's authorization to remain in the country. The fear in his eyes when he explained this wasn't manipulative or calculated, just honest anxiety about losing the life he'd built in America over the past years. I offered to help research his options, spending evenings reading through immigration law websites and forums, trying to understand the labyrinthine system that seemed designed to reject rather than welcome. When Derek's employer announced his retirement 6 months into our relationship, panic set in. Derek had 30 days to find new sponsorship or leave the country. The companies he interviewed with weren't willing to navigate the complex visa sponsorship process for someone without specialized skills or advanced degrees. I watched him unravel during those weeks, the confident man I'd fallen for becoming hollow-eyed and desperate as the deadline approached. On day 27, I made a decision that felt simultaneously impulsive and inevitable. I contacted an immigration attorney named Claudia Reyes whose office was located in a sleek building downtown, and I asked her about sponsoring Derek myself as his employer. Claudia had dark eyes that missed nothing as she listened to my plan. She explained the requirements, the financial obligations, the legal responsibilities I would assume. I would need to prove I could pay him a prevailing wage for whatever position I created. I would need to demonstrate a legitimate business need for his employment. I would become legally responsible for ensuring he didn't become a public charge. The solution I proposed was registering a small consulting LLC focused on international market research, something that utilized Derek's language skills and cultural knowledge while meeting the legal requirements for sponsorship. My salary as a mid-level marketing strategist at a growing Portland firm was sufficient to meet the financial thresholds. Claudia prepared the paperwork with professional efficiency while also pulling me aside before I signed anything. "You're taking on significant liability for someone you've known less than a year," she said quietly, making sure Derek was out of earshot. "If this relationship doesn't work out, you're still legally obligated to support his visa status until it expires or he adjusts to permanent residency. That process can take years." "I understand," I told her, though I'm not sure I fully grasped the weight of what I was to in that moment. Love makes you believe in permanent things, in futures that stretch out unblemished and uncomplicated. I signed the papers. Derek's visa was approved. He cried with relief when the notification arrived, holding me so tightly I could feel his heartbeat against my chest. He promised he would make this up to me, that he would build something worthy of my faith in him, that I would never regret choosing him. The first few years felt like vindication of my choice. Derek threw himself into the consulting work with genuine enthusiasm, landing several small clients through his networking efforts. We moved in together to a modest apartment in the Pearl District, splitting expenses and building a life that felt authentically ours rather than something imposed by circumstance. He cooked elaborate Eastern European meals on weekends, teaching me about his childhood in Moldova through food and stories. I introduced him to hiking in the Columbia River Gorge, to the peculiar Portland obsession with coffee and microbreweries, to my small circle of friends who gradually accepted him as part of our group. His visa renewals became routine, an administrative task I handled every few years with Claudia's assistance. The legal relationship between us as employer and employee existed on paper, a necessary framework that allowed the real relationship to flourish. Derek proposed on a foggy morning at Cannon Beach, kneeling in the sand near Haystack Rock while seagulls circled overhead and early morning joggers pretended not to watch. The ring was modest, chosen thoughtfully within a budget we discussed beforehand. I said yes without hesitation, imagining a future where his visa status would eventually normalize through marriage and permanent residency, where the legal scaffolding supporting our relationship could finally be dismantled and we could just exist as two people who chose each other. What I didn't anticipate was how marriage would shift the family dynamics that had remained mostly abstract until Derek's mother decided to visit America for our wedding. Svetlana Volkov arrived 3 weeks before the ceremony with 2 massive suitcases and an agenda that became immediately apparent. She had opinions about everything, delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who believed her way was not just correct but morally superior. The venue I'd chosen was adequate but lacked grandeur. My dress was too simple, too modern, insufficiently feminine. The guest list was too small, though she had no intention of contributing financially to accommodate more attendees. The menu needed revision to include traditional dishes, never mind that most guests wouldn't be familiar with or appreciate them. Derek mediated these conflicts with increasing weakness, trying to satisfy both his mother and me while ultimately defaulting to whatever would create the least immediate friction. I watched him transform in her presence, becoming smaller and more deferential, the confident man I'd married reverting to an obedient son seeking approval he would never fully receive. The cultural clashes extended beyond wedding planning into fundamental questions about our relationship and future. Svetlana made it clear she expected us to provide her with grandchildren immediately, preferably sons, and that I would naturally step back from my career to focus on family obligations. When I mentioned my recent promotion to senior marketing strategist, she smiled thinly and said that was nice, as if I'd shared a hobby rather than a professional achievement. She questioned why we didn't own a house yet, conveniently ignoring that Portland's housing market required dual high incomes and that Derek's consulting work remained sporadic despite his efforts. She asked pointed questions about my family background, my education, my accomplishments, each inquiry designed to highlight perceived deficiencies in my pedigree compared to the imaginary woman she'd envisioned for her son. Derek's brother Yuri arrived a week before the wedding, adding another layer of family dynamics I hadn't prepared for. Unlike Derek, Yuri had remained in Europe, building a moderately successful construction business and embracing traditional values that made even Svetlana seem progressive by comparison. He immediately aligned with his mother in the campaign to reshape me into something more acceptable, offering unsolicited advice about appropriate behavior for a wife in their culture. The apartment that had felt spacious for 2 people became claustrophobic with 4, Svetlana's presence pervading every corner as she rearranged my kitchen to suit her preferences and made dismissive comments about my furniture choices. The morning of the wedding, I sat in the bridal suite at Pittock Mansion while a hairstylist worked on my updo and listened to Svetlana hold court in the adjacent room. She spoke in Russian to the other family members who traveled for the ceremony, her voice carrying clearly through the thin walls even though I couldn't understand the words. Derek's cousin Elena translated bits and pieces for me later, her face apologetic as she revealed that Svetlana had been complaining about how American women were spoiled and demanding, how I clearly had trapped Derek through his visa situation, how he could have done so much better if he'd been patient and found a proper wife from a good family back home. The words landed like physical blows, each one confirming what I'd been sensing but trying to ignore. To this family, I wasn't Derek's partner or equal. I was an obstacle, a temporary inconvenience, someone to be tolerated until Derek's status normalized and he could make better choices. I should have called off the wedding then. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Looking back with the clarity that only distance provides, I can see all the red flags I chose to ignore that day. Derek's failure to defend me to his family. The way he prioritized keeping his mother happy over protecting my dignity. The fundamental incompatibility between the life I wanted and the traditional role his family expected me to fill. But I'd spent 3 years building a relationship with this man, navigating visa applications and legal complications, intertwining my professional reputation and financial stability with his immigration status. Walking away felt impossible when I'd invested so much in making this work. So I let the hairstylist finish my updo, applied my makeup with steady hands, and put on the dress Svetlana had criticized for being too plain. I walked down the aisle to Derek waiting at the altar in his tailored suit, his smile warm and his eyes suspiciously bright with emotion. We exchanged vows that promised partnership and mutual support, words that felt sincere in the moment even as they proved hollow within hours. The ceremony itself was beautiful in the way Portland weddings often are, taking advantage of the mansion's historic architecture and sweeping views of the city and mountains beyond. My friend Iris Chin served as maid of honor, her presence a reminder that I had people in my corner even if Derek's family viewed me with disdain. Claudia Reyes sat in the back row, her attendance a professional courtesy that I appreciated more than she probably realized. Tom and Beverly Patterson, my elderly neighbors who'd become surrogate grandparents over the years I'd lived in the Pearl District, beamed from their seats near the front. These people had seen me build my career, had witnessed my growth from an uncertain young professional to someone confident in her abilities and worth. Their presence anchored me as I made promises to a man whose family had made clear I would never be good enough regardless of what I achieved or contributed. The reception started smoothly enough, with dinner service and the usual sequence of toasts from the wedding party. Derek's best man, a college friend named Anton, gave a sweet speech about their friendship and how happy Derek seemed since meeting me. Iris made everyone laugh with stories about my terrible cooking attempts when we'd first become friends and how Derek had somehow convinced me that I actually enjoyed his experimental fusion cuisine. My boss Marcus Green said kind words about my work ethic and dedication, noting that Derek was lucky to have found someone so capable and committed. Then Svetlana requested the microphone. I assumed she planned to offer the traditional mother of the groom toast, perhaps share a sentimental memory about Derek's childhood or welcome me to the family with diplomatic warmth even if she didn't genuinely feel it. Instead, she delivered a speech that started with faint praise before sliding into outright insult. She acknowledged that Derek had built a life in America through hard work and determination, carefully avoiding any mention of my role in making that possible. She referenced his successful career, glossing over the reality that his consulting business barely broke even most months. Then she pivoted to me, her smile never wavering as she described me as ordinary, as someone who brought nothing to the family, as a choice Derek had settled for rather than actively chosen. The words hung in the air as guests processed what they'd just heard. Some laughed nervously, assuming it was an awkward joke lost in translation. Others sat in stunned silence, recognizing the hostility beneath the polite phrasing. Derek's hand found mine under the table, his grip tight enough to hurt. I waited for him to stand up, to take the microphone from his mother, to publicly defend me the way a husband should protect his wife on their wedding day. He did nothing. His thumb rubbed circles on my palm in what I suppose he meant as comfort, but his silence spoke louder than any words. He was willing to hold my hand in private while allowing his mother to humiliate me in public, a pattern that would define our marriage until I finally broke it. I sat frozen in my chair, my face burning with shame and rage, searching the crowd for friendly faces that could anchor me. Iris looked ready to commit violence, half risen from her seat until I shook my head slightly. Claudia's expression remained neutral, but she pulled out her phone and appeared to be taking notes. Tom Patterson's weathered hand covered Beverly's where it rested on the table, both of them watching me with concern that made my eyes sting with unshed tears. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of forced smiles and mechanical movements. I cut the cake, danced with Derek to a song that now felt like mockery, accepted congratulations from guests who either hadn't registered Svetlana's insult or were too polite to acknowledge it. Several people pulled me aside to express their shock and support, their kindness only making the humiliation worse because it confirmed I hadn't imagined or misinterpreted what had happened. Derek attempted damage control by claiming his mother's English wasn't good enough to realize how her words had sounded, an excuse that insulted both her intelligence and mine. Svetlana herself seemed pleased with her performance, holding court among the Eastern European guests who apparently saw nothing wrong with a mother publicly diminishing her son's choice of wife. We spent our wedding night in the honeymoon suite at a boutique hotel downtown, a room I'd booked months earlier when I still believed this marriage would be a joyful beginning rather than a profound mistake. Derek tried to initiate physical intimacy, seemingly oblivious to how his mother's words and his own silence had created a chasm between us that couldn't be bridged by romantic gestures. When I pulled away, he finally attempted the apology that should have come hours earlier. "She didn't mean it the way it sounded," he insisted, his accent thickening the way it always did when he was stressed. "You know how traditional she is, how direct people from her generation can be. It's cultural differences, not personal." I stared at him in the dim light filtering through the hotel curtains, seeing clearly for the first time who I'd actually married. Not the vulnerable man seeking help with his visa situation, not the loving partner who'd built a life with me, but someone who would always choose the path of least resistance even when that path ran directly over my dignity. The morning after my wedding, I woke up alone in the honeymoon suite with a clarity that felt almost physical, as if someone had removed a film from my eyes that had been obscuring my vision for years. Derek had left early to drive his mother and brother to the airport for their return flight, prioritizing their convenience over spending our first married morning together. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd postponed our actual honeymoon because Svetlana had insisted on staying the full 3 weeks of her visa waiver, and now Derek was chauffeuring her around while I sat in an overpriced hotel room still wearing yesterday's smudged makeup. I ordered room service coffee and sat by the window overlooking the Willamette River, watching joggers and cyclists move along the waterfront path with enviable purpose and direction. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from friends checking on me after the reception disaster, but I couldn't bring myself to respond with the reassuring lies they probably expected. When Derek finally returned 3 hours later, he brought pastries from a bakery near the airport and the kind of cheerful demeanor that indicated he'd already moved past yesterday's events. His mother and Yuri had made their flight with time to spare, he reported, as if this mundane update was what I'd been anxiously awaiting. He seemed genuinely confused when I didn't share his relief at their departure, when I didn't immediately accept his offering of almond croissants as a peace treaty sufficient to close the conversation about what had happened at our wedding. "We need to talk about yesterday," I said, my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Derek sighed heavily, setting down the pastry bag with exaggerated weariness that suggested I was being unreasonable by bringing this up again. "We already discussed this last night," he said. "My mother speaks without thinking sometimes. It's not worth ruining our honeymoon over a misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding ricocheted around my skull like a bullet. There had been no misunderstanding in Svetlana's carefully enunciated English as she'd announced to 200 people that I was ordinary and unworthy. There had been no confusion in the looks of pity and shock from guests who'd witnessed my public humiliation. There had been no ambiguity in Derek's silence when his mother had verbally eviscerated me while he sat 2 feet away holding my hand under the table like that constituted support. I spelled this out for him in sentences so simple a child could understand them, watching his face cycle through defensiveness and irritation before landing on wounded innocence. "You're being unfair," he said finally. "I can't control what my mother says." What did you want me to do? Cause a scene at our own wedding by confronting her in front of everyone? The question hung between us, highlighting the fundamental disconnect in how we viewed partnership and loyalty. Yes, I told him. That's exactly what I wanted. I wanted you to take the microphone from her hand and tell everyone that your wife is brilliant and accomplished and the reason you're still in this country. I wanted you to make it clear that disrespecting me has consequences, that you won't tolerate anyone treating me like I'm less than you or your family. I wanted you to choose me over keeping the peace with a woman who flew across an ocean specifically to tell me I'm not good enough for her son. Derek's face flushed with anger, his accent thickening as his voice rose. So this is really about the visa situation, he snapped. You want me to humiliate myself by admitting to everyone that I needed your help to stay in America. You want me to announce that I'm dependent on you like some kind of charity case. His words revealed an insecurity I'd known existed but had never heard articulated so baldly. The visa sponsorship that I'd framed as partnership and mutual support, he experienced as emasculating dependence. The legal and financial obligations I'd assumed to keep us together, he resented as a power imbalance that undermined his dignity. The argument spiraled from there into territory we'd carefully avoided throughout our relationship. Derek accused me of holding the sponsorship over his head, of using his immigration status as leverage to control him. I countered that I'd never once mentioned the visa situation during conflicts, that I'd gone out of my way to avoid making him feel indebted, that the only person bringing it up now was him. He claimed I didn't understand the pressure of living in a country where your right to exist depended on paperwork and bureaucratic approval, where one mistake or stroke of bad luck could result in deportation and losing everything you'd built. I pointed out that I understood better than most Americans because I'd been navigating that system on his behalf for years, managing renewals and legal requirements while he got to live his life without worrying about the administrative burdens. Round and round we went, each accusation revealing layers of resentment that had been accumulating silently beneath the surface of our relationship. By the time we checked out of the hotel that afternoon, we'd reached an exhausted stalemate. Derek apologized for losing his temper but maintained that I was overreacting to his mother's comments. I accepted the apology while recognizing it didn't address the actual problem, which wasn't his anger but his unwillingness to prioritize my feelings over his mother's ego. We drove back to our Pearl District apartment in silence, the city passing outside the windows in a blur of familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign and unwelcoming. The apartment itself seemed different when we walked in, as if the 3 weeks of Svetlana's occupation had fundamentally altered its character. Her rearranged kitchen cabinets remained exactly as she'd left them, a small territorial claim that Derek hadn't bothered to undo. The guest room still smelled faintly of her perfume, a cloying floral scent that made my stomach turn. I spent the next week moving through my life on autopilot, returning to work at the marketing firm where at least my competence and value were recognized and appreciated. My colleagues congratulated me on the wedding, their enthusiasm dimming when they registered my lack of reciprocal excitement. Iris cornered me in the break room on my third day back, her direct approach cutting through the polite pretense everyone else maintained. That speech from Derek's mother was absolutely unhinged, she said without preamble. Please tell me you're not just accepting that as normal behavior. I assured her I wasn't, though I had no clear plan for what accepting it would actually look like beyond continuing to feel angry and hurt while Derek insisted I move on. Iris studied my face with the keen attention of someone who'd known me long enough to read my silences. You know you don't have to stay married to someone whose family treats you like garbage, she said quietly. Even if the divorce is complicated because of the visa situation, there are ways to handle it. The thought had occurred to me approximately 10,000 times since the wedding reception, but hearing someone else voice it made the possibility feel more real and less like a betrayal of the relationship I'd invested so much in building. I asked Iris what she knew about visa implications for divorce, and she pulled out her phone to show me articles she'd apparently already researched on my behalf. The legal situation was complex but not impossible. Derek's current visa was tied to the consulting business I'd created to sponsor him, which technically could continue operating regardless of our marital status. However, the marriage itself had created additional pathways to permanent residency that would be complicated to navigate if we separated before his green card was approved. More importantly, if I withdrew my sponsorship entirely, Derek would have limited time to find alternative authorization to remain in the country or face deportation. The power dynamics Iris outlined made me profoundly uncomfortable. I held Derek's future in my hands in a way that felt heavy and unwieldy, a responsibility I'd assumed out of love but which now created a moral dilemma I hadn't anticipated. Walking away from the marriage would potentially destroy his immigration status and force him to leave the life he'd built in America over the past decade. Staying in the marriage meant accepting treatment from his family that eroded my self-worth and damaged my mental health. Neither option felt ethical or sustainable. I thanked Iris for the information and promised to think about my options, then went back to my desk and stared blankly at marketing reports I couldn't focus on while my thoughts spun in useless circles. That evening, Derek announced his mother wanted to video call to discuss some family matter. I declined to participate, citing work deadlines that were real but could have waited. I listened from the bedroom as Derek spoke Russian with Svetlana for over an hour, his tone alternating between placating and defensive in a pattern I'd observed during her visit. When he finally ended the call, he found me lying in bed scrolling mindlessly through my phone and delivered news that confirmed my worst suspicions about where his loyalties ultimately resided. "My mother wants to come back for an extended visit," he said carefully. "Maybe 2 or 3 months this time. She's having some health issues and thinks the change of scenery would be good for her recovery. She could help around the apartment, do some cooking, give you a break from household responsibilities." The audacity of this proposal left me momentarily speechless. The woman who'd publicly declared me unworthy at my own wedding now wanted to move into my home for a quarter of the year and do me the favor of taking over household tasks I'd never asked for help with. Derek interpreted my silence as consideration rather than stunned disbelief, continuing with his pitch about how much money we'd save on her hotel costs and how nice it would be to have family around. When I finally found my voice, I told him absolutely not. There was no scenario in which I would welcome Svetlana Volkov into my living space for 3 months after what she'd said and done. Derek's face hardened in a way I'd rarely seen, his jaw setting with stubborn determination. "She's my mother," he said flatly. "She's family. You're asking me to choose between my wife and my mother, and that's not fair." The hypocrisy was stunning. He'd had no problem choosing his mother over me at our wedding when she'd humiliated me in front of everyone we knew. He'd had no problem prioritizing her comfort during her 3-week visit even when her behavior made me miserable in my own home. But now that I was setting a boundary about not hosting her for an extended stay, suddenly I was the unreasonable one creating impossible choices. I explained this to Derek as calmly as I could manage, pointing out that he'd already made his choice repeatedly and it hadn't been me. He accused me of being vindictive and holding grudges, of punishing him for his mother's behavior as if he could control what she said. We argued in circles until nearly midnight, neither of us willing to concede ground on this issue that had become a proxy battle for the larger questions about respect and partnership in our marriage. Over the following weeks, the apartment became a Cold War zone of passive aggression and pointed silences. Derek sulked about my refusal to host his mother, bringing up the topic periodically as if repetition would wear down my resistance. I retreated into work and friendships outside our marriage, spending longer hours at the office and accepting every invitation from Iris and other friends to get coffee or see movies or do anything that gave me respite from the tension at home. My job performance actually improved during this period, as if channeling my emotional turmoil into professional achievement provided an outlet that marriage no longer offered. Marcus Green noticed my increased dedication and pulled me into his office one afternoon to discuss a potential promotion to marketing director, a role that would significantly increase my salary and responsibilities while positioning me for eventual VP track. The promotion opportunity should have been cause for celebration, a validation of the career I'd built while simultaneously managing Derek's immigration needs and trying to be a supportive partner. Instead, it highlighted how little my professional achievements mattered within my marriage. When I told Derek about the potential promotion over dinner that night, his response was tepid congratulations followed immediately by concern about how the increased workload would affect my availability at home. Would I still have time to handle the household management and cooking? Would the stress impact my health? Wouldn't it make more sense to wait a few years until we had more stability before taking on additional professional responsibilities? Each question revealed his underlying assumption that my career existed in service to our domestic life rather than being valuable in its own right. I accepted the promotion without further discussion with Derek, recognizing that seeking his approval or input would only lead to arguments about priorities and sacrifice. The new role came with a substantial raise that made me the primary breadwinner by an even larger margin than before, a fact that seemed to bother Derek more than he wanted to admit. His consulting business had plateaued, bringing in enough income to cover his personal expenses but nothing close to what would be required to sponsor his own visa or support a household. The financial imbalance fed into his existing insecurities about depending on me for his immigration status, creating a feedback loop of resentment that poisoned our interactions. He began making passive-aggressive comments about my work schedule, implying I was prioritizing my career over our marriage. He questioned whether I was actually at the office during my long hours or if I was spending time with someone else, jealousy manifesting as accusation without evidence. The erosion of trust went both directions. I started noticing how Derek's version of events in conversations with his family diverged significantly from reality. During another video call with Svetlana that I overheard from the next room, he described his consulting business as thriving while downplaying my new role as just a small title change. He portrayed our disagreement about her extended visit as my general hostility toward his family rather than a specific boundary about not hosting someone who'd publicly insulted me. He accepted his mother's continued criticism of me without defending me, responding with non-committal sounds that could be interpreted as agreement. Each conversation I overheard chipped away at my belief that Derek was my partner rather than simply someone sharing my living space while pursuing his own interests. 3 months into our marriage, I woke up on a Saturday morning and realized I felt relieved that Derek had stayed out late the night before at a gathering with his Eastern European friends, giving me the apartment to myself. The relief was followed immediately by crushing sadness because I understood what it meant. I'd spent years building a relationship with this man, navigating complex immigration systems and legal obligations to keep us together, yet now I felt happier in his absence than his presence. The marriage had become something to endure rather than enjoy, a series of conflicts and compromises that left me feeling diminished. I thought about Claudia's warning before I'd signed the initial sponsorship papers, about taking on legal liability for someone I'd known less than a year. I'd been so certain then that love would be enough, that our partnership was strong enough to weather the complications of visa sponsorship and cultural differences. The woman in that immigration attorney's office seemed impossibly naive now, someone who'd confused intensity of feeling with genuine compatibility. I made coffee and sat on our small balcony watching the city wake up, the Saturday morning quiet broken only by occasional traffic and the distant sounds of the farmers' market setting up in the park several blocks away. My phone buzzed with a text from Beverly Patterson asking if I wanted to join her and Tom for their weekly breakfast at a diner in the neighborhood. The invitation was casual, the kind of standing offer they'd extended regularly since I'd moved into their building 4 years ago. During the early stages of my relationship with Derek, I'd often declined these invitations to spend time with him instead. Lately I'd been accepting more frequently, finding comfort in the Pattersons' steady presence and uncomplicated affection. I texted back that I'd meet them in 30 minutes, then dressed quickly and left the apartment before Derek returned home. The diner was a Portland institution, unchanged for decades with its vinyl booths and laminated menus and waitresses who'd worked there longer than I'd been alive. Tom and Beverly sat in their usual spot near the window, already sipping coffee and reading the newspaper in companionable silence. They greeted me with warm hugs and immediate offers of the bacon they always ordered extra of because they knew I loved it. We settled into easy conversation about neighborhood gossip and local news, the kind of superficial topics that didn't require emotional vulnerability. But Beverly had known me long enough to sense when something was wrong, and halfway through breakfast she set down her coffee cup and looked at me with gentle directness. "How are you really doing, sweetheart?" she asked. And please don't say fine, because we both know that's not true. The kindness in her voice cracked something open inside me, and suddenly I was crying in a diner booth while an elderly couple I'd adopted as surrogate grandparents held my hands and let me fall apart. The story poured out in fragments, everything I'd been holding in since the wedding reception. Svetlana's speech and Derek's failure to defend me. The constant criticism and impossible expectations from his family. The growing resentment about the visa sponsorship that I'd never intended as a power dynamic but which Derek increasingly viewed as emasculating dependence. The loneliness of being married to someone who prioritized keeping peace with his mother over protecting my dignity. Tom listened with the focused attention of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize genuine pain when he heard it. Beverly passed me paper napkins for my tears and made sympathetic sounds while rubbing my arm in gentle comfort. When I finally ran out of words, Tom spoke with the measured wisdom that came from 53 years of marriage to Beverly. Sounds like you married a boy who's still trying to earn his mother's approval instead of a man who knows his own mind, he said simply. That's not something you can fix for him, Natalie. He's got to grow up on his own, and you've got to decide if you want to wait around while he figures it out. Beverly nodded agreement, adding her own perspective shaped by decades of watching young couples navigate the early years of marriage. Love isn't enough if it only goes one direction, she said. Marriage is supposed to be two people building each other up, not one person constantly making themselves smaller to keep the peace. You're allowed to want more than this, honey. You're allowed to expect your husband to choose you. Their words stayed with me long after breakfast ended, echoing through my mind as I walked back to the apartment through the Saturday morning bustle of Portland streets. The farmers' market had fully opened by then, vendors selling early summer produce and artisan goods to crowds of shoppers with their reusable bags and dogs on leashes. I used to love these Saturday mornings, the ritual of browsing the stalls and picking out ingredients for weekend meals. Derek and I had spent countless mornings like this in the early days of our relationship, him explaining how different vegetables were prepared in Moldovan cuisine while I suggested fusion approaches that combined his traditions with Pacific Northwest ingredients. Those memories felt like they belonged to different people now, a couple who'd existed before resentment and family interference had poisoned what we'd built together. Derek was home when I returned, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and papers spread across the surface. He looked up when I entered, his expression carefully neutral in the way it had been since our fight about his mother's proposed visit. "Where were you?" he asked, the question hovering somewhere between genuine curiosity and accusation. "Breakfast with Tom and Beverly," I answered, setting my keys on the counter and moving to pour myself water. Derek's mouth tightened slightly at the mention of my elderly neighbors, whom he'd always viewed with faint condescension as if their friendship with me was somehow inappropriate or strange. "They're nice people, but you spend a lot of time with them lately," he observed. "More than you spend at home with your husband." The comment was designed to provoke guilt, to make me feel like I was neglecting my marital obligations by seeking comfort outside our deteriorating relationship. A few months ago it might have worked, might have sent me into apologetic explanations about how I was just trying to maintain friendships and didn't mean to make him feel abandoned. But standing in our kitchen on that Saturday morning, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't responsible for managing Derek's feelings about my friendships. I wasn't obligated to center my entire social life around a marriage that was making me progressively more miserable. "I spend time with people who make me feel valued and respected," I said evenly. "That's something I'm not getting much of at home lately." Derek's face flushed with anger, his accent thickening as he pushed back from the table. "So now I don't value or respect you? Is that what you're saying? After everything I've done to try to make this marriage work despite your hostility toward my family?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of his framing, this revisionist history where I was the hostile party rather than someone who'd been publicly humiliated and privately dismissed. I didn't take the bait, instead moving past him toward the bedroom to change out of my breakfast clothes. The conversation was pointless, another circular argument that would end with both of us angry and nothing resolved. Derek followed me, his frustration evident in the sharp movements as he gestured while talking. "We can't keep avoiding difficult conversations," he insisted. "We need to talk about how to fix this." I sat on the edge of our bed and looked at him standing in the doorway, really looked at him for the first time in weeks. He'd put on weight since the wedding, stress eating combined with reduced activity making his face fuller and his clothes fit differently. His hair needed cutting, growing shaggy in a way that might have seemed appealingly disheveled on someone younger but just looked unkempt on him. But the physical changes weren't what struck me most. It was the entitlement in his posture, the expectation written across his features that I would once again do the emotional labor of fixing what was broken between us while he offered minimal effort beyond showing up for the conversation. "How do you think we fix this, Derek?" I asked quietly. "What are you actually willing to change?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, as if he'd expected me to present solutions he could then approve or reject rather than being asked to contribute his own ideas. He stammered for a moment before defaulting to familiar territory. "You could be more understanding about my mother," he started. "She comes from a different generation and culture. If you just give her a chance and stop holding grudges about things she said, we could all move forward." I shook my head slowly, a strange calm settling over me as I recognized the fundamental impossibility of what he was suggesting. Your mother told 200 people at our wedding that I'm ordinary and not good enough for you, I said. She questioned what I bring to your family despite the fact that I've been legally and financially responsible for keeping you in this country for years. And instead of defending me or setting boundaries with her, you're asking me to be more understanding. Derek's expression shifted from frustration to something that looked almost like panic, as if he sensed the conversation heading somewhere he couldn't control or redirect. That's not fair, he protested. You know how complicated family dynamics are. I can't just cut off my mother because she said something insensitive at our wedding. I'm not asking you to cut her off, I replied, my voice steady despite the emotion churning inside me. I'm asking you to prioritize your wife over your mother's ego. I'm asking you to set boundaries that protect our marriage instead of expecting me to absorb endless disrespect to keep family peace. That's what partners do for each other, Derek. They choose each other. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken truths we'd both been avoiding. Derek looked away first, his gaze fixing on some point beyond the bedroom window. I don't know how to do that, he admitted finally, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I don't know how to disappoint her. She sacrificed everything to give Yuri and me opportunities. She worked 3 jobs after my father left. She sent money she didn't have so I could come to America for school. How do I tell her that her opinions about my life don't matter? The vulnerability in his confession stirred something in me that wasn't quite sympathy but closer to recognition. I understood the weight of parental expectations and the guilt that came with disappointing people who'd made sacrifices on your behalf. But understanding didn't change the fundamental problem, which was that Derek's inability to set boundaries with his mother meant there was no room for me to exist as a full person in our marriage. You figure it out, I said quietly. You go to therapy, you read books, you do whatever work you need to do to become someone capable of being a real partner. But you don't ask your wife to make herself smaller and accept mistreatment while you figure it out. That's not fair and it's not sustainable. Derek's face cycled through several emotions before landing on resentment. So what are you saying? That you want a divorce? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized I didn't have a clear answer. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to end a marriage that had been a mistake from the moment I'd ignored the red flags and walked down that aisle. But another part remembered the years before the wedding, the genuine connection we'd shared, the possibility that with enough work we might find our way back to something healthy. I don't know what I want, I told him honestly. But I know I can't keep living like this. Something has to change, and it has to be real change, not just you apologizing and then everything going back to how it was. Derek nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat or possibly relief that I hadn't immediately demanded divorce. I can change, he said, the words reflexive and unconvincing. I'll talk to my mother, set some boundaries. We can go to couples counseling if you want. I'll do whatever it takes. The promises felt hollow even as he made them, scripts delivered by someone who knew the right words but didn't fully grasp their meaning or implications. Still, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe the years I'd invested in this relationship hadn't been completely wasted, that the man I'd fallen for in that Seattle hotel lobby still existed somewhere beneath the defensive, resentful person he'd become. We agreed to try couples counseling, a compromise that felt simultaneously like hope and capitulation. Derek found a therapist through his health insurance, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Patricia Moore who specialized in cross-cultural relationships and immigration-related stress. Our first session was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, a time slot that required me to leave work early and Derek to rearrange a client meeting he'd mentioned multiple times as if the inconvenience was a sacrifice comparable to what I'd been enduring. We sat in Dr. Moore's modest office in uncomfortable chairs positioned at careful angles while she asked intake questions about our relationship history and current challenges. Derek presented our issues as primarily about cultural misunderstandings and my difficulty accepting his family's traditional values. I countered with the actual timeline of events, from Svetlana's wedding speech through Derek's consistent failure to defend me or prioritize our marriage. Dr. Moore listened to both versions with professional neutrality, taking notes in a leather-bound journal while maintaining eye contact that suggested she was tracking not just our words but the dynamics beneath them. When we'd both finished our opening statements, she asked Derek a question that seemed simple but proved illuminating. Can you tell me what specifically your mother said at the wedding reception? Derek hesitated, his face showing the internal calculation of how to present the incident in the most favorable light. She made some comments about cultural differences, he started vaguely. Nothing that terrible, just pointing out that Natalie comes from a different background than what our family is used to. Dr. Moore turned to me with raised eyebrows. Is that an accurate representation of what was said? I pulled out my phone and opened the recording I'd asked Iris to make of the reception speeches, something I'd requested as a wedding keepsake but which now served as evidence. I played Svetlana's toast in its entirety, watching Dr. Moore's professional neutrality crack slightly as the speech progressed from backhanded compliments to outright insults. When it finished, she turned back to Derek with a directness that made him shrink in his chair. That wasn't a comment about cultural differences, she said. That was a public humiliation of your wife at your wedding. Can you help me understand why you're characterizing it differently? Derek stammered through an explanation about translation nuances and how his mother's English sometimes came across harsher than she intended, excuses that sounded weak even to his own ears in the face of recorded evidence. Dr. Moore spent the rest of the session establishing what she called baseline facts, things we both agreed were objectively true regardless of interpretation. Fact: Svetlana had made disparaging comments about me at our wedding. Fact: Derek had not publicly defended me or addressed his mother's behavior. Fact: I had been sponsoring Derek's visa for several years before we married. Fact: Derek's consulting income was significantly less than my salary. Fact: we had fundamental disagreements about family boundaries and priorities. Laying it out this clinically made the dysfunction of our marriage impossible to ignore or minimize. We left the session with homework assignments, individual exercises meant to help us identify our core needs and non-negotiable boundaries. Derek seemed subdued on the drive home, finally confronting perhaps the gap between his narrative of our marriage and the reality a neutral third party reflected back. The counseling sessions continued weekly, slowly peeling back layers of resentment and miscommunication that had accumulated over years. We learned communication techniques and conflict resolution strategies, practiced active listening exercises that felt artificial but occasionally produced moments of genuine understanding. Derek acknowledged that he struggled with setting boundaries with his mother, a pattern established in childhood that he'd never examined or challenged. I recognized my own tendencies toward people-pleasing and conflict avoidance, ways I'd enabled Derek's behavior by not demanding better treatment earlier. The work was hard and often frustrating, sessions ending with both of us emotionally exhausted and no closer to resolution on fundamental issues. But outside the controlled environment of Dr. Moore's office, the patterns persisted. Derek would commit to having difficult conversations with his mother about respecting me, then find reasons to postpone them. He'd agree to prioritize our marriage in the moment, then default back to appeasing his family when actual conflicts arose. His consulting business continued struggling, the income irregular enough that my salary became increasingly essential to maintaining our lifestyle. The visa situation loomed over everything like a storm cloud, never directly discussed but always present in the power dynamics between us. I found myself calculating timelines in quiet moments, figuring out how long until Derek's green card application could be filed, how many more years of sponsorship obligation I'd committed to, what my legal liability looked like if I withdrew support. 4 months into marriage and 2 months into couples counseling, Derek announced that Svetlana had booked another trip to Portland. She'd purchased the tickets without consulting us first, presenting the visit as a fait accompli rather than a request. She'd be arriving in 3 weeks and staying for 6 weeks this time, having apparently interpreted Derek's failure to set boundaries as implicit permission to involve herself in our lives however she chose. Derek delivered this news apologetically but with an undertone of expectation that I would accept it, that the counseling had somehow obligated me to be more accommodating of his family. When I responded with immediate and absolute refusal, his face hardened with familiar stubbornness. "We can't tell her not to come," he argued. "She already bought the tickets. Where is she supposed to stay if not with us?" "A hotel," I suggested. "Or an extended stay rental. Or your brother can host her since he thinks her behavior is perfectly acceptable. Anywhere except our apartment where I'll be forced to interact daily with a woman who despises me." Derek's voice rose in frustration, accusing me of being unreasonable and using therapy as a weapon to make impossible demands. The argument escalated quickly, both of us abandoning the communication techniques Dr. Moore had taught us in favor of familiar patterns of accusation and defense. "You're trying to isolate me from my family," Derek shouted at one point. "This is exactly what abusive partners do, cut off outside relationships so they have complete control." The accusation was so absurd and hurtful that I actually laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "I'm trying to protect myself from abuse from your family," I corrected. "There's a difference." The fight ended with Derek storming out of the apartment, leaving me alone with my anger and a creeping sense that our marriage had reached a breaking point that counseling couldn't bridge. I called Claudia Reyes the next morning, requesting an appointment to discuss my legal options regarding Derek's visa sponsorship and our marriage. Claudia fit me in that same afternoon, her calendar apparently flexible enough to accommodate what she correctly interpreted as an urgent situation. I sat in her office overlooking the Willamette River and laid out the situation in clinical detail, trying to keep emotion out of my voice as I explained how untenable my marriage had become. Claudia listened with the same focused attention she'd given me years ago when I'd first inquired about sponsoring Derek, taking notes and asking clarifying questions about timelines and documentation. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and regarded me thoughtfully. "You have several options," she began, "none of them simple but all of them viable. First, you can continue the visa sponsorship while divorcing Derek. The business relationship is legally separate from the marriage, so you could maintain his work authorization while ending the personal relationship. However, this creates complications because he'd need to demonstrate he's still actually working for the consulting company, and if he's not generating income, that becomes difficult to justify. Second option is withdrawing sponsorship entirely, which gives Derek 30 days to find alternative authorization or leave the country. Third option is maintaining the status quo and hoping things improve, though based on what you've told me, that seems unlikely to result in your well-being or happiness." I asked about the ethical implications of withdrawing sponsorship, the question that had been gnawing at me since I'd first considered ending the marriage. Would I be responsible for Derek's deportation if I refused to continue supporting his visa? Claudia's expression softened slightly, recognition perhaps of the moral weight I was carrying. "You're responsible for your own well-being," she said gently. "Derek is an adult who chose to build his life in a country where his status depended on sponsorship. You offered that support in good faith as his partner, but you're not obligated to continue it indefinitely if the relationship becomes harmful. Lots of visa sponsorships end when relationships end. That's a normal consequence Derek would have understood when he accepted your help. He's had years to pursue alternative pathways to permanent residency or prepare for the possibility that this arrangement might not last forever." Her words gave me permission I hadn't realized I needed to prioritize my own needs without being consumed by guilt about Derek's immigration status. We discussed practical timelines and documentation I should gather, bank statements showing my financial contributions to household expenses, records of visa renewal fees I'd paid, emails and texts that demonstrated the pattern of disrespect from Derek's family and his failure to address it. Claudia advised me to open a separate bank account and begin redirecting my paychecks there, establishing financial independence before making any final decisions about the marriage. She also suggested consulting with a divorce attorney sooner rather than later, getting clear on what asset division would look like and what my obligations were regarding spousal support. I left Claudia's office feeling paradoxically both heavier and lighter, weighted down by the decisions ahead but relieved to have a roadmap for navigating them. I followed her advice about the bank account, opening it that afternoon and setting up automatic transfers from my checking account to begin building a financial cushion separate from Derek's access. The secrecy felt like betrayal even though I was simply protecting myself, years of conditioning toward transparency in relationships conflicting with my growing recognition that this particular relationship wasn't safe enough for complete vulnerability. I began documenting everything systematically, saving text messages and emails, keeping a private journal of incidents and conversations, building a record that could support my version of events if things became contentious. Derek returned home late that night, subdued and apparently ready to pretend our fight about his mother's visit hadn't happened. He didn't apologize or address the issue, instead moving through the apartment like nothing was wrong while I watched this avoidance with new eyes informed by Claudia's counsel. The next morning over coffee, I told him calmly that his mother could visit Portland but she would not be staying in our apartment under any circumstances. This wasn't a negotiation or a topic for further discussion, simply a boundary I was establishing regardless of his feelings about it. Derek's face went through several expressions before landing on cold anger. "Fine," he said shortly. "I'll rent her an apartment nearby and spend time with her there since you're so determined to keep us separated." The passive-aggressive framing was designed to make me feel guilty, to paint me as the villain preventing his son from spending time with his mother. But I refused to accept that characterization, responding with equal calm that he was welcome to spend as much time with Svetlana as he wanted in whatever accommodation he arranged. I simply wouldn't be participating or hosting her in my home. Derek seemed thrown by my refusal to engage in the guilt trip, his anger shifting to confusion as he tried to find purchase in an argument I wasn't having. Over the following days, he attempted various approaches to changing my mind, from renewed apologies about his mother's wedding speech to promises that this visit would be different because he'd talked to her about being more respectful. None of it moved me, my resolve hardened by weeks of counseling that had revealed Derek's fundamental unwillingness to change patterns that benefited him even when they harmed me. Svetlana arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, the Portland summer heat making the air thick and uncomfortable as Derek drove to the airport to collect her. I stayed at work deliberately late that day, accepting an invitation from Iris to get dinner and drinks rather than returning home to face whatever drama would unfold when Derek explained the new accommodation arrangements. Over Thai food and wine, I confessed to Iris that I'd been consulting with lawyers and preparing for the possibility of divorce. Her response was immediate support mixed with relief that I was finally taking concrete steps to protect myself. She'd been watching me deteriorate over the months since the wedding, she admitted, seeing me become progressively more withdrawn and less like the confident woman she'd befriended years earlier. Iris worked in tech with the kind of salary that made my marketing income look modest by comparison, and she offered without hesitation to help financially if I needed support leaving Derek. The generosity moved me to tears, this reminder that I had people in my corner who valued me and wanted me to be happy. I assured her I was financially stable thanks to my recent promotion and careful saving, but the offer itself meant more than she probably realized. We talked late into the evening about next steps and timelines, Iris asking practical questions about my lease and asset division that helped me think through logistics I'd been avoiding. The apartment was in both our names, but I'd paid the security deposit and covered the majority of rent over the years we'd lived there. Most of the furniture was mine, purchased before Derek and I moved in together. The separation itself would be cleaner than the emotional work of actually executing it. When I finally returned home around 10 that night, Derek was waiting up with barely contained fury. His mother had been deeply hurt by the news that she wasn't welcome to stay with us, he reported, his voice tight with anger. She'd cried on the drive from the airport, questioning what she'd done to deserve such cruel treatment from her daughter-in-law. Derek had secured her a small furnished apartment in Beaverton, a suburb about 20 minutes away, and the cost was going to strain his already limited finances. He expected me to feel guilty about this, to recognize how my unreasonable boundary was causing hardship for everyone. Instead, I felt only a grim satisfaction that for once Derek was experiencing consequences for prioritizing his mother's feelings over our marriage. I told him the arrangement sounded perfectly adequate and went to bed without further discussion, leaving him fuming in the living room. Over the next few days, Derek spent increasing amounts of time at Svetlana's apartment, sometimes not coming home until late at night or occasionally staying over there entirely. His absence should have provided relief but instead filled the apartment with a different kind of tension, the waiting quality of a situation hurtling toward inevitable confrontation. Svetlana began calling me directly, leaving voicemail messages in heavily accented English about how disappointed she was in how I was treating her son, how American women didn't understand family loyalty, how she'd raised Derek to be a good man only to watch me corrupt him with my selfish attitudes. I didn't return the calls or engage with the provocation, instead forwarding the messages to Claudia as documentation of the harassment I was experiencing. Dr. Moore had taught us about boundaries and consequences in our couples sessions, concepts Derek seemed constitutionally incapable of applying to his relationship with his mother. Each voicemail Svetlana left reinforced my growing conviction that this marriage couldn't be salvaged, that the family dynamics were too entrenched and Derek's enabling too deeply rooted for counseling to address. I began sleeping better on the nights Derek stayed at his mother's apartment, my body relaxing in his absence in ways that told me everything I needed to know about the health of our relationship. 3 weeks into Svetlana's visit, Derek asked me to join them for Sunday dinner at a Georgian restaurant in southeast Portland. He framed it as an opportunity for his mother and me to start fresh, to move past our difficulties and build a better relationship. The invitation felt like a trap, but I was curious about what they thought a fresh start might look like given nothing about the fundamental situation had changed. I agreed to meet them at the restaurant, driving separately so I could leave on my own timeline if the evening became unbearable. The restaurant was a small family-owned place with traditional decor and a menu entirely in Georgian with English translations underneath. Svetlana was already seated when I arrived, Derek beside her looking nervous in a way that immediately put me on edge. The meal started with strained pleasantries, Svetlana commenting on my appearance in ways that managed to be both complimentary and critical. I looked healthy, she observed, though perhaps I'd gained a little weight since the wedding. My hair was nice, though she preferred when women my age wore it longer and more feminine. Each statement was delivered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, small cuts designed to undermine while maintaining plausible deniability about hostile intent. Derek watched these interactions without intervening, his face showing discomfort but not the protectiveness a husband should display when his mother was subtly attacking his wife. I responded to Svetlana's comments with bland politeness, refusing to give her the satisfaction of visible reaction. Midway through the meal, Svetlana shifted her approach from passive aggression to direct confrontation. She set down her fork and looked at me with an expression of concern that was entirely performative. "Natalie, I want to understand why you have turned my son against his family," she began, her accent making each word deliberate. "Since you married him, Derek is different. He makes excuses not to visit, he keeps me away from his home, he forgets his culture and traditions. This is not the boy I raised." I glanced at Derek, expecting him to correct his mother's characterization, to explain that I hadn't turned him against anyone and that the boundaries were responses to her behavior, not unprovoked hostility. He remained silent, studying his plate with intense focus as if the arrangement of food was fascinating. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable before I responded directly to Svetlana. "I haven't turned Derek against anyone," I said evenly. "I've set boundaries about being disrespected in my own marriage and my own home. Those are different things." Svetlana's eyes narrowed, her pleasant facade dropping entirely. "Disrespected," she repeated, loading the word with contempt. "American women are so sensitive, always thinking everything is about them. In my culture, family comes first. A wife supports her husband's family, she doesn't make demands and create divisions." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to something more threatening. "You think you are so important because you helped Derek with his papers, with his visa. But let me tell you something, he could find other ways to stay in America. He doesn't need you as much as you think he does." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, Svetlana's implication clear that I was replaceable and my leverage through visa sponsorship wasn't as powerful as I believed. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a clarity that cut through months of confusion and doubt. This woman had flown across the world to try to intimidate me into accepting mistreatment, to break down my boundaries through a combination of guilt and threats. And Derek was sitting right there letting it happen, his silence a form of complicity that spoke louder than any words. I stood up calmly, placing my napkin on the table and collecting my purse. "I'm done with this conversation," I said. "Derek, when you're ready to have an actual marriage where you prioritize your wife over your mother's ego, you know where to find me. Until then, I'm not participating in these performances." I walked out of the restaurant without looking back, my hands shaking as I unlocked my car and sat in the driver's seat trying to steady my breathing. My phone started buzzing almost immediately with calls from Derek that I declined repeatedly. Text messages followed, alternating between apology and accusation, claiming I'd embarrassed him and his mother by walking out but also acknowledging that Svetlana had crossed a line. The contradictions in his messages reflected the fundamental confusion at the core of our marriage, Derek's inability to hold his mother accountable while simultaneously recognizing that her behavior was unacceptable. I drove to Cannon Beach instead of home, the 90-minute journey giving me time to process what had happened and what needed to happen next. The small coastal town had always been a refuge for me, a place I'd visited regularly before meeting Derek and less frequently since as our relationship consumed more of my time and energy. I checked into a modest hotel near the beach and spent the evening walking along the shore watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple while waves crashed against Haystack Rock in the distance. The physical distance from Portland helped me think clearly without the constant pressure of Derek's presence and expectations. I called Claudia from the beach and left a voicemail asking her to begin preparing divorce paperwork, my voice steady as I made the request official. Then I called the divorce attorney she'd recommended, a woman named Jennifer Walsh whose firm specialized in complex marital dissolutions involving immigration issues. Jennifer's intake coordinator scheduled me for a consultation the following week, gathering basic information about assets and timeline over the phone. I spent 2 nights in Cannon Beach, using the time to draft a mental inventory of our shared possessions and separate out what was genuinely important to me versus what I could walk away from without regret. The apartment lease renewed in 3 months and I decided I wanted Derek out before then, willing to cover the full rent myself rather than continue cohabitating through the divorce process. My salary could support the expense, especially now that I wasn't subsidizing Derek's sporadic consulting income and covering the household expenses he'd increasingly failed to contribute to. When I returned to Portland on Thursday evening, Derek was waiting in the apartment with an intensity that suggested he'd been there for hours. He started talking before I'd even fully closed the door, a prepared speech about how sorry he was for Sunday dinner and how he'd had a serious conversation with his mother about boundaries. Svetlana had agreed to return to Moldova earlier than planned, cutting her visit short by 2 weeks. Derek had explained to her that her behavior was jeopardizing his marriage and she needed to respect me if she wanted to maintain a relationship with him. The concession sounded meaningful on the surface, exactly the kind of boundary setting I'd been requesting for months. But the timing made it transparently reactive rather than genuine, a scramble to contain damage rather than authentic change in how Derek related to his family. I let him finish his speech before responding with the decision I'd reached on the beach. "I've contacted divorce attorneys," I said simply. "I'm done with this marriage, Derek. I'm done being disrespected by your family and unsupported by you. I'm done with counseling that teaches us communication skills you refuse to actually implement when it matters. I'm done making myself smaller to accommodate people who don't value me." His face went white, shock replacing the cautious hope that had been there moments before. "You can't be serious," he said. "We just need more time, more counseling. I told you I talked to my mother. I'm making changes. Everything I've been asking you for, I'm doing it now." "Too late," I told him. "You're doing it now because you're afraid of consequences, not because you genuinely believe I deserve better treatment. That's not change, Derek. That's damage control." His shock morphed into anger, his voice rising as he accused me of giving up on our marriage without really trying, of being inflexible and unforgiving, of throwing away years together over resolvable conflicts. I stood my ground against the onslaught of words, my decision insulated by months of slowly building conviction that this relationship was fundamentally broken. When Derek finally ran out of steam, I delivered the information about visa sponsorship that I'd been holding in reserve. "I'm withdrawing my sponsorship of your work visa effective in 30 days, I said. "That gives you time to find alternative authorization or make arrangements to leave the country." The color that had drained from Derek's face earlier returned in a rush, his cheeks flushing dark with rage. "You can't do that," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You'd destroy my entire life, force me to leave everything I've built here, all because you're upset about some family drama? This is cruel, Natalie. This is vindictive." I felt nothing but cold certainty as I corrected him. "I can do that, and I am. You've had a decade to pursue permanent residency through other channels. You've had years to build a consulting business that could sponsor you independently. You chose instead to rely entirely on me while treating me like an inconvenience when I asked for basic respect. Those were your choices, Derek. Now you get to live with the consequences." He tried multiple approaches over the next hour to change my mind, cycling through anger and pleading and bargaining and threats. He'd contest the divorce and make it as difficult and expensive as possible. He'd tell everyone we knew that I'd abandoned him over minor disagreements. He'd report me to immigration authorities for fraudulent sponsorship, a threat so absurd given the documented legitimacy of our business arrangement that it only reinforced how desperate he'd become. None of it moved me, my resolve hardened by months of mistreatment and the clarity that had come from finally making a decision. I told Derek he had 1 week to move out of the apartment, offering to cover moving expenses if he left peacefully. After that, I'd begin formal eviction proceedings if necessary. Derek left that night to stay at his mother's apartment, the door slamming behind him with enough force to rattle the pictures on the wall. I sat in the sudden silence of the empty apartment, waiting for the relief or grief or some emotional response to wash over me. Instead, I felt mostly numb, exhausted from months of conflict and emotionally spent from the confrontation. I opened a bottle of wine and drank a glass while looking around the space that had been my home for years, already mentally redecorating it for a life that wouldn't include Derek's presence or his family's interference. The next morning I called Tom and Beverly to let them know what was happening, needing their steady support as I navigated the difficult weeks ahead. They came over that evening with homemade soup and the kind of practical comfort that came from decades of life experience. Tom helped me change the locks on the apartment door, a preemptive measure since Derek still had keys and I didn't trust him not to return when I wasn't home to retrieve items or cause problems. Beverly sat with me reviewing the list of shared assets, helping me identify what was legitimately mine versus what Derek might have claimed to in the divorce. Most of the valuable items were things I'd purchased before we'd moved in together, furniture and electronics and kitchen equipment that predated our relationship. Derek's contributions had been minimal, some artwork from Moldova and his personal electronics, but nothing that would create significant disputes during asset division. The week Derek had to move out passed in tense silence, his few visits to collect belongings happening without conversation beyond logistics. He took his clothes and personal items, a few pieces of furniture he'd inherited from a family friend, and his laptop and work materials. The apartment looked sparse after his departure but felt lighter somehow, as if his absence created space for me to expand back into areas I'd contracted away from during our marriage. Svetlana left angry voicemails accusing me of ruining her son's life and promising that I'd regret my cruelty. I blocked her number after saving the messages as evidence of harassment, one more piece of documentation for the growing file related to our divorce. Jennifer Walsh, the divorce attorney, proved to be exactly what I needed during this period. She was in her 50s with steel gray hair and a no-nonsense approach that cut through emotional complexity to focus on legal strategy and practical outcomes. During our first meeting, she reviewed the documentation I'd brought and nodded approvingly at how thoroughly I'd prepared. "You've done good work protecting yourself," she said. "The visa sponsorship complicates things slightly, but the separation of business and personal relationship gives us clean arguments for why withdrawal of sponsorship is justified." She explained that Derek would likely try to claim the sponsorship withdrawal was retaliatory, an attempt to punish him for the marriage failing. Our counter-argument would focus on the documented pattern of disrespect from his family, his failure to contribute financially to the household, and the business reality that his consulting work hadn't generated sufficient income to justify continued sponsorship. Jennifer also prepared me for the possibility that Derek might try to delay the divorce to maintain his visa status longer, filing motions and requesting continuances to stretch out the timeline. Oregon's divorce laws required a waiting period, but we could begin the formal filing immediately, getting the clock started on the mandatory separation period. She drafted a comprehensive petition that outlined my requests for asset division, specified that I was seeking no spousal support and would contest any request from Derek for financial assistance, and formally notified him of the visa sponsorship termination. The petition was served to Derek at Svetlana's apartment 10 days after he'd moved out, the process server confirming delivery and his shocked reaction upon receiving the paperwork. Derek's response came through his own attorney 2 weeks later, a younger lawyer who specialized in immigration law and had apparently been recommended by someone in Derek's Eastern European community. The response contested nearly everything in my petition, claiming that I'd promised to sponsor Derek through permanent residency regardless of our marital status, that our consulting business was thriving and my withdrawal of sponsorship was purely vindictive, and that he deserved spousal support given his financial dependence during our marriage. Each claim was either completely false or a wild distortion of reality, but Jennifer assured me this was standard strategy in contentious divorces. Derek's attorney was posturing, she explained, making aggressive demands as negotiating positions that would eventually be walked back during settlement discussions. The legal process ground forward with frustrating slowness, each motion and countermotion extending the timeline and increasing costs. Derek seemed determined to make the divorce as difficult as possible, perhaps believing that if he created enough obstacles I'd eventually give up and return to the marriage. Instead, each delay only strengthened my resolve, confirming that I'd made the right decision in ending a relationship with someone who responded to boundaries with punishment. I threw myself into work during this period, the demands of my director-level position providing welcome distraction from divorce proceedings. Marcus Green noticed my increased dedication and pulled me aside one afternoon to check on my well-being, having heard through office gossip about my separation. "I'm managing," I told Marcus honestly, appreciating his concern without wanting to delve into personal details at work. He nodded understanding and then surprised me by mentioning an upcoming opportunity with our Seattle office. They needed someone to lead a major rebranding project for a tech client, a 6-month assignment that would require relocating temporarily but would position me perfectly for VP consideration when I returned. The timing felt serendipitous, offering both professional advancement and physical distance from the mess of divorce proceedings. I accepted immediately, grateful for the chance to rebuild my life in a new city while the lawyers battled over asset division and visa technicalities. The Seattle assignment started in October, giving me just enough time to finalize the apartment situation in Portland. I decided to sublet rather than break the lease, finding a young couple through Iris who needed temporary housing while their condo purchase closed. Tom and Beverly agreed to keep an eye on the place and forward any important mail, their steady presence a comfort as I packed my essentials for the extended stay in Seattle. Derek showed up unannounced the day before I left, somehow having learned about the move through mutual acquaintances. He looked terrible, weight loss making his face gaunt and his clothes hanging loose on his frame. "This is really happening," he said, standing in the doorway of the apartment he no longer had keys to access. "You're just leaving, starting over like our marriage meant nothing." I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy but couldn't quite overcome the months of resentment his choices had created. "Our marriage did mean something," I replied. "It taught me that I deserve better than what you were willing to give. That's valuable even if it's painful." Derek's eyes filled with tears as he made one final plea for reconciliation, promising he'd cut off his mother entirely if that's what it took, swearing he understood now what he'd lost and would spend the rest of his life making it up to me if I'd just give him another chance. The promises might have even been sincere in that moment, born from genuine regret and fear of losing his life in America. But sincerity wasn't enough to overcome the fundamental truth that Derek only seemed capable of change when facing consequences, not because he valued me enough to do the work when it was just about my happiness. I told him no gently but firmly, wishing him well in whatever came next but closing the door on any possibility of reconciliation. He left quietly, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and I finished packing with a sense of completion rather than loss. Seattle welcomed me with October rain and the kind of fresh start I hadn't realized I desperately needed. The project was challenging and consuming, requiring long hours and creative problem-solving that left little time for dwelling on my failed marriage. I made new friends among the Seattle office staff, went on a few casual dates that reminded me I was still young and had options, and slowly began to reconstruct an identity that wasn't defined by Derek or his family's expectations. The divorce proceedings continued in the background, Jennifer keeping me updated on developments while handling most of the legal maneuvering herself. 4 months into my Seattle assignment, Jennifer called with significant news. Derek's visa had expired and he'd been unable to secure alternative sponsorship despite months of searching. Immigration had given him a final deadline to depart voluntarily or face deportation proceedings that would bar him from re-entering the United States for years. Faced with this reality, Derek had suddenly become much more cooperative about divorce terms, dropping his demands for spousal support and contested asset division in exchange for my agreement to expedited proceedings. We settled everything within 2 weeks, the final decree granting me sole ownership of our former shared property and officially severing all legal and financial connections between us. Derek left for Moldova in early March, his decade-long American chapter closing with a whimper rather than the dramatic confrontation his mother had probably envisioned. Claudia forwarded me a brief email he'd sent to her office, thanking her for her professional services over the years and asking her to convey to me that he was sorry for how things had ended. I read it once and then deleted it, feeling nothing but mild relief that this phase of my life was conclusively finished. The Seattle project wrapped successfully in April, my work earning praise from both the client and senior leadership at the firm. Marcus offered me the VP position as promised, a promotion that came with substantial salary increase and the kind of professional validation I'd been working toward for years. I returned to Portland in May to an apartment that felt like mine again, redecorated during my absence by the subletting couple who'd left it cleaner and more updated than they'd found it. Tom and Beverly threw me a welcome home dinner, their evident pride in how I'd navigated the divorce filling me with warmth. Iris organized a celebration with our friend group, toasting to new beginnings and the end of settling for less than I deserved. Standing in my living room surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my well-being, I realized that Derek's abandonment of me through his family's cruelty had accidentally given me permission to abandon a life that had been making me smaller. The woman who'd stood at that wedding reception absorbing public humiliation while her husband sat silent would barely recognize who I'd become. Sometimes the greatest gift is discovering you're strong enough to walk away from people who don't value you, even when walking away means dismantling everything you thought you wanted. Derek had been wrong about many things, but mostly about assuming I needed him more than he needed me. Turns out the ordinary American girl he'd settled for was extraordinary enough to build a life that didn't require his presence or his mother's approval. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.